The desert stretched to every horizon like an endless sheet of shimmering metal, reflecting the morning sun with a cruelty that made the ground look alive. Heat rose from the dunes in wavering curtains, and the air felt dry enough to crack open a person's lungs with each breath. The moment the transport shuttle lifted off, the cadets realized just how unforgiving this training zone would be. Silence rolled across the sand as the engines faded into the distance and left the group alone under the strengthening daylight. The instructors had not exaggerated in the briefing. This was the harshest sector of the Academy's survival grounds, a region where exposed rock fractured under the temperature swings and where deep dunes swallowed anything left on the surface for more than a day. The assignment was simple only on paper: survive 24 hours without external supplies. According to the instructors, the zone had no natural water sources, no hidden reservoirs, and no shade suitable for shelter. Everything had to be created, not found. Most of the alien cadets reacted the way anyone unfamiliar with Earth's survival traditions would. A tall cadet from a cold ocean world pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, already overwhelmed by the sun's intensity. Another cadet with silver skin and large reflective eyes tried to scan the terrain for moisture, but the readings were flat and empty. A third cadet let out a low, discouraged sound as her boots sank into the burning sand. Panic moved through the group like a ripple, small at first, then growing as the reality of dehydration settled into every mind. Even the strongest cadets understood that a person could last only a short time in conditions like these without water, and the thought of an entire day under the desert sun felt impossible. Some began walking in random directions, convinced that the instructors must have hidden something, perhaps a supply crate or an underground spring. Others argued quietly as the heat pressed down on their shoulders and sapped the strength from their legs. Liam stood among them with a calm expression that did not match the rising anxiety around him. He tightened the strap of his empty pack and scanned the landscape, not in desperation, but with the quiet focus of someone studying a puzzle. He knew he would not find an oasis or a freshwater pool because he had listened carefully during the briefing. When the instructors said the desert contained no water sources, they had spoken with the clipped certainty of professionals who chose their words precisely. That meant the statement was true from the perspective of someone searching for rivers, streams, or ponds. It did not necessarily mean the desert held no moisture at all. Liam understood that dryness was not an absolute condition, but a matter of distribution. Even the driest environments possessed hidden pockets of water, some trapped in soil, others in plants, others in the air itself. The other cadets were searching for something obvious. He was searching for something subtle. He lowered himself to one knee, letting the sand spill through his fingers. The grains were scorching on the surface but slightly cooler beneath, a sign that heat escaped quickly overnight. That temperature difference meant morning condensation sometimes formed on the rocks, even if it evaporated before midday. He lifted a small piece of cracked stone and held it toward the light. The underside still carried a faint hint of dampness, a thin trace that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. For Liam, it was confirmation. Moisture existed here. It was simply not accessible in a form the other cadets recognized. A shout echoed across the dunes as one of the alien cadets claimed he had spotted something shimmering far away. Several others rushed after him, their shadows already shrinking under the intensifying sun. Liam watched them run without judgment. He understood hope could drive a person to chase a mirage even if logic warned against it. However, every step spent wandering aimlessly would drain the group of strength and sweat. Sweat was water. Water was life. In a place like this, losing even a small amount unnecessarily was a mistake no one could afford. Liam rose to his feet and began walking in the opposite direction, not toward an imagined glimmer, but toward a cluster of stones jutting from the sand. As he approached, he studied their layout, noticing how the taller rocks cast narrow strips of shade that persisted even when the sun climbed higher. That shade created microclimates, small areas where moisture lingered longer than elsewhere. On Earth, he had learned that these zones often hid clues about what lay beneath the surface. The instructors probably believed the cadets would exhaust themselves searching for non-existent rainwater. Liam had no intention of relying on something as random as weather. He needed a method that depended only on physics, not luck. He crouched near the rocks and brushed aside a thin layer of sand. The ground underneath was slightly darker, another sign that moisture existed deeper down. He placed his palm over the spot, letting the warmth of his skin reveal how quickly the soil released heat. The desert was telling him everything he needed. The instructors had designed this zone to look hopeless to anyone who approached survival as a search for items. But Liam approached survival as a problem of transformation. If the desert refused to offer water directly, then he would extract water from the desert itself. A soft wind swept across the sands and carried with it the faint groans of cadets struggling in the distance. Some had already collapsed to sit under minimal shade, trying to shield their eyes from the glare. Others paced in circles near the drop-off point, unsure whether to keep searching or stay put. None of them noticed how Liam moved with purpose, scanning the land for materials instead of praying for rescue. His mind ran through old lessons drilled into him during his childhood, lessons passed down from hikers, rescue workers, and adults who understood the logic of disadvantage. When resources were scarce, the answer was not to find more, but to create functionality from what already existed. He found fragments of old equipment half buried near the rocks, likely discarded by previous exam groups. Most of it was useless, but some pieces caught his attention. A cracked visor shield that could be repurposed, a torn fragment of reflective fabric, and a handful of bent metal anchors that once held tents in place. As he pulled them from the sand, the sun beat down even harder, making his clothing cling to his skin. He wiped the sweat from his forehead not because he wanted relief, but because he hated wasting water. His instincts were already shifting into survival mode, where every drop mattered and every mistake had a price. The exam had barely begun, yet Liam understood something the others had not. Surviving this desert did not require strength, endurance, or blind hope. It required controlled thought under pressure. It required the ability to look at an environment designed to kill a person and see not danger, but potential. While the alien cadets searched for solutions imposed by their imaginations, he focused on the undeniable laws of nature that would not betray him. The sun was the enemy and the tool. The sand was the obstacle and the resource. The air was suffocating and nourishing at the same time, depending on how someone used it. Nothing in the desert was useless. The instructors believed the cadets would discover that after many failures. Liam intended to discover it before anyone else even realized the truth. By the time he finished surveying the immediate area, the sun had begun to climb aggressively toward its peak. The sky brightened with a sharp intensity that signaled the beginning of the most dangerous hours. The cadets who had run after the mirage slowed to a halt, realizing too late they had been chasing nothing. Liam watched them return with slumped shoulders and unsteady steps. He felt no desire to criticize them. He cared only about ensuring his own survival, and for that, he needed to begin immediately. Sheer willpower would not save him. Water would. And if the instructors insisted this desert had no water sources, then he would simply create one with his own hands. He looked once more across the dunes, allowing the landscape to imprint itself clearly in his mind. Then he turned back toward the materials he had collected and began planning his next move, fully aware that the exam intended to break weaker cadets long before nightfall. What the instructors had not anticipated was that a single human, armed with patience and knowledge, could look at an empty wasteland and already start building a solution before anyone else even understood the problem. Liam moved along the rocky outcrop with measured steps, keeping his breathing steady as the rising heat wrapped around him like a tightening coil. The sun had already begun its steep ascent, turning the air into a shimmering haze that made distant dunes blur and wobble like hot metal. Every second in such an environment mattered. He understood that the desert rewarded precision and punished impulse, so he kept his focus sharp, watching how the land behaved under the pressure of daylight. The cadets who had wandered off began to return in scattered groups, each one slower and more exhausted than before, but he gave them only a passing glance. He had no interest in joining the chorus of frustration swelling behind him. His attention remained fixed on the environment itself, on the countless small signals hidden beneath the surface where most people never thought to look. He knelt again near a cluster of stones and lifted a handful of sand into his palm. The grains slipped between his fingers, but he held the last of them long enough to feel a faint coolness at the base of his skin. That subtle difference hinted at moisture far deeper than the surface suggested. He shifted closer to the largest stone and leaned his shoulder against it. The rock radiated intense heat from the side exposed to the sun, but the opposite side remained cooler, almost welcoming. Shade meant a temporary retreat from evaporation, a place where trapped water could resist the sun's efforts for a little longer. He pressed his hand into the darkened soil beneath the rock and felt the faintest resistance, softer than the surrounding dunes. That softness mattered. It meant the ground held something the instructors insisted did not exist. He began scraping away thin layers of sand with deliberate strokes. Each handful revealed a darker shade beneath, as if the earth hid secrets that resisted the sun's tyranny. The crack of shifting stones echoed behind him as a cadet approached, but he kept his eyes lowered, unwilling to break his rhythm. The cadet hesitated for a moment, watching Liam work, then walked away when it became clear Liam had no interest in conversation. He valued silence during moments like these, moments that demanded absolute attention. The desert had a language of its own, subtle and unforgiving, and he needed to listen to every nuance. When he reached a depth of several inches, he paused and inspected the surface. Moisture clung to the soil in almost invisible traces, but he recognized the faint shine that revealed its presence. He lifted the grains close to his face, letting the sun catch them. The glimmer was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what he suspected. The desert did hold water. It simply refused to offer it in any form the cadets would understand. He would need to extract it himself, but for that he had to gather enough material to build something functional. His hands sank deeper, searching for anything that could indicate a denser patch of moisture-rich soil. When he struck a pocket of cooler earth, he released a quiet breath. That was the clue he needed. He rose slowly and scanned the terrain with a renewed sense of clarity. The dunes were not uniformly shaped. Some sloped gently, others steepened sharply as if pushed by wind currents that repeated patterns year after year. The clusters of stones formed natural windbreaks, trapping sand in precise configurations that revealed how air moved across the desert. Liam followed the invisible trails the wind carved, observing how certain depressions retained fine-grained sand rather than coarse fragments. Fine sand suggested compaction. Compaction suggested depth, and depth could hide moisture that had survived long nights of cooling. He traced the crescent-shaped patterns the dunes formed and aligned them to the sun's path. The heat struck the land unevenly, and he needed to know exactly where nature offered the greatest advantage. A small bird-like creature shrieked from overhead, its wings beating frantically as it crossed the test zone in search of food. Liam shielded his eyes and watched it drift toward a distant ridge. It circled once, then twice, then dipped low as if drawn by something barely visible from the ground. He followed its path with interest. Animals rarely wasted energy in such harsh environments unless something in the terrain promised a reward. Perhaps insects nested there. Perhaps the soil trapped nutrients. Or perhaps the ridge held a denser concentration of plant roots. Roots meant life. Life meant moisture. Even the smallest plant held water if someone knew how to extract it. He walked toward the ridge, maintaining a steady pace that did not force his body to expend more energy than necessary. The sand shifted under his boots, but he leaned forward slightly to counter the slope. Each step brought him closer to a collection of pale bushes clinging stubbornly to life despite the heat. Their thin branches vibrated slightly in the wind, casting trembling shadows that danced across the ground. He crouched and examined one of the bushes closely. The leaves were tiny yet firm, designed to reduce evaporation. He snapped a small piece of branch between his fingers. A faint scent rose from it, earthy and sharp. He squeezed gently, and a drop of moisture appeared at the fracture point. It evaporated quickly, but he had seen it. The cadets behind him struggled visibly. Some watched him from afar, puzzled by his calm movements. A few whispered among themselves, but none approached. He suspected they expected him to fail eventually, as they believed the instructors had engineered the exam to ensure that no one could overcome the lack of water. But Liam knew hardship had layers. Surface discomfort blinded the cadets to the fact that survival was often a matter of gathering information rather than reacting emotionally. He continued examining the bushes until he identified a cluster with thicker roots. He dug around the base with his hands, clearing the sand carefully to avoid damaging the plant too much. When he uncovered part of the root system, he saw the moisture clinging to the fibers. It was not enough to drink directly, but it was enough to serve as a source for extraction. He pulled back and exhaled slowly. The environment had offered him the clues he needed. Moisture existed in the soil, in the plants, and likely even in the air trapped near the ground. The desert held water in pockets and fragments, concealed from casual observers. What he required now was a method to harness the sun's energy to gather all those scattered traces and turn them into something meaningful. The solution had already begun forming in his mind as he sifted sand through his hands again. The moisture would not come to him. He would bring it out through heat, pressure, and time. His thoughts aligned as cleanly as gears locking into place. The key was not to search endlessly for an impossible spring. The key was to build a device that used the desert's punishing heat to work for him rather than against him. He stood with a sense of quiet purpose and looked back toward the area where he had collected materials earlier. The ridge had confirmed everything he suspected. He now understood the land well enough to commit to the next step. He had the rocks, the scraps, the membranes, the metals. He had the knowledge. He had the environment itself working as an unintentional ally. The exam was not a test of endurance. It was a test of understanding. He turned toward the outcrop once more, ready to gather everything he needed to begin the construction he already envisioned in detail, aware that with each passing minute, the sun grew stronger and the conditions harsher. But that only made his resolve sharper. If the desert insisted on offering only clues, then he would use every one of them. Liam returned to the rocky outcrop with a quiet determination that steadied his steps even as the desert heat tightened around him like an invisible grip. The sun had climbed high enough to bleach the sky into a pale, merciless blue, and the ground shimmered as if the sand itself were melting. He barely noticed the discomfort anymore. His mind worked faster than his body, tracing the outline of the device he intended to build. The desert would give him nothing willingly, but the sun offered more energy than he could ever need. He only had to trap that energy correctly. He dropped to one knee beside the scattered materials he had collected earlier. The cracked visor shield caught his immediate attention. He lifted it and tilted it toward the light, observing how the plastic refracted the sun's rays. Even in its damaged condition, it remained transparent enough to function as the top layer of a solar still. He rubbed away a smudge of sand and nodded slightly to himself. It would not form a perfect seal, but perfection was not required. Efficiency was. He placed the visor on the ground and shifted his focus to the torn sheet of reflective fabric. When he stretched it between his hands, the material glimmered with a heat-resistant shine. That fabric could help insulate the pit he planned to dig, slowing the loss of warmth during the extraction process. He folded it carefully, then reached for the bent metal anchors. The anchors were the most important pieces. He would need them to secure the covering over the pit, preventing the wind from lifting it and disrupting the condensation process. He tested the strength of each anchor by pressing it into the sand. None snapped or bent further. Good. He spread the tools before him and considered the design again. On Earth, he had built similar contraptions during survival training, though never in conditions this severe. Here, the heat would work faster. The still would gather moisture from soil and plant material much more quickly than in a temperate environment, but the extreme dryness also meant that every mistake would cost him precious time. He exhaled once, long and slow, then selected a spot near the shade of the outcrop. He knelt down and pressed his hands into the sand. The surface burned like hot metal, but he ignored the discomfort and began digging. At first, the sand moved easily, sliding away in steady flows, but the deeper layers resisted, clinging in compact clusters. He alternated between scooping with his palms and slicing downward with the edge of a flat stone. His movements remained controlled and deliberate, conserving energy even as his arms began to ache from the repetitive motion. The desert rewarded rhythm. He found it quickly, carving a widening circle that grew into a shallow pit. When he reached a depth suitable for placing a container, he paused and assessed the shape critically. The pit needed smooth walls for heat to reflect evenly. He scraped away rough edges, forming a gentle slope that directed the basin toward the center. Once satisfied with the shape, he lined the bottom with the reflective fabric and pressed it firmly into place. The fabric conformed to the contours of the pit, trapping the deeper heat and preventing moisture from escaping into the surrounding sand. Liam anchored the edges with small stones, then stepped back to roll his shoulders and allow the muscles in his back a moment of relief. He reached for the cracked visor again and envisioned it stretched across the pit. Before he set it in place, he collected a handful of plant roots from the bushes he had examined earlier. He arranged them inside the pit in loose clusters, allowing space for vapor to rise and condense. The roots would release moisture steadily, especially under the relentless heat of the sun. He covered the roots lightly with a dusting of soil, then placed a metal container in the center of the pit to catch the condensation. It sank slightly into the sand, steady and stable. Now the structure needed its final component, a sealed cover with a central point for droplets to slide toward. He positioned the visor over the pit and pressed the metal anchors into the sand to hold it in place. The visor bowed slightly from the tension, but that curvature would actually improve efficiency, guiding condensation toward a single downward point. He tapped the visor gently to test its stability. It wobbled but did not shift. The desert wind blew past him with a low hum, but the visor remained unmoved. He allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The structure was far from perfect, yet it carried the essential shape of a functional still. With steady care, he placed a smooth stone on the center of the visor, creating a downward curve that led directly above the container. When droplets formed, they would gather under the visor, slide along the slanted surface, and fall straight into the waiting basin. He crouched low and inspected the seal along the edges. A few gaps remained, small ones, but significant enough to let heat escape. He pulled loose lengths of fabric from his pack and pressed them along the edges to reduce airflow. The seal improved. He pressed down with both hands to ensure uniform contact between the visor and the sand. The structure held firm. Liam sat back on his heels and exhaled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The device stood like a strange, transparent dome, half buried in the sand, shimmering as the sun bore down upon it. The visor already warmed under the growing intensity of the heat. Soon the temperature inside the pit would rise enough to draw moisture from the soil and plant material. He knew the process would take time, but time was something he still possessed. The cadets scattered across the test zone watched him with growing curiosity, though none approached. From their distant vantage points, the structure probably looked like nothing more than a pile of scrap arranged in a circle. He did not care. Water would fill the container long before they understood what he was building. He rested briefly in the shade of the rock formation and allowed his heartbeat to slow. His throat ached with dryness, and his lips began to crack under the heat, but he pushed aside the discomfort. The desert did not care about suffering, and he refused to give it the satisfaction of seeing him break. He stood again and circled the still with careful steps, checking the angles and adjusting the anchors. Everything held. He estimated that the first droplets might appear within an hour, perhaps sooner if the plant roots released moisture quickly. The visor's interior began to fog at the edges, a promising sign that heat was gathering beneath the surface. He leaned closer and watched the first faint shimmer of vapor rise from the soil. It was barely noticeable, but it was real. The still was working. He paced a short distance away and scanned the horizon for additional materials. He would need more containers if he wanted to maximize the yield. The exam required him to survive, but he intended to go beyond mere survival. He wanted to gather enough water to withstand not only this day, but any unexpected challenges the instructors might spring upon the cadets after sunset. He spotted more metal fragments buried near a collapsed tent frame and began walking toward them. The sun pressed against his back with blistering weight, but his stride remained confident. He had built the first foundation of his plan. Now he would expand it. The desert remained silent, but for the first time since the exam began, Liam felt it shift in his favor. Liam walked back toward the first solar still with a handful of metal fragments pressed against his chest, his fingers curled tightly around the sharp edges to keep them from slipping in the shifting sand. The sun hammered the desert with such intensity that the horizon quivered in the heat, bending light until the world looked warped and fluid. Sweat trickled down his neck, and he wiped it away with the back of his wrist, annoyed at the loss of even a small fraction of moisture. He quickened his pace as he approached the still, wanting to confirm that the condensation process had begun. The visor glowed with a faint sheen of steam beneath its surface, a promising sign that the interior temperature had risen fast. He crouched beside it and leaned close, watching how small beads of moisture clung to the underside of the visor, trembling slightly before gathering into larger droplets. He felt a controlled surge of relief. The device was functioning exactly as he expected. The sun supplied the heat, the soil and roots supplied the moisture, and the visor trapped the vapor, forcing it to condense. He tapped one finger lightly against the surface, careful not to disturb the slope. The droplets quivered and began sliding downward toward the central point, where the stone created a funnel-like shape. He straightened with a quiet exhale. The first still would produce a measurable amount of drinkable water within an hour, but he needed more than one pit if he intended to gather enough to fill multiple containers before sunset. The instructors would judge output, not intentions. He had to scale the operation quickly. He scanned the outcrop for additional suitable locations. The desert offered only two reliable advantages: heat and exposure. He needed positions where the sun hit the sand directly without interruption. He found such a place a few meters away, near a half-buried ridge of stones. He knelt and pressed his palm into the sand, testing its temperature. The heat nearly burned his skin, which meant the ground would accelerate the vaporizing process. He brushed the sand aside in a circular motion, clearing a patch large enough to begin digging the second pit. He set the metal fragments aside and retrieved the flat stone he had used earlier. His arms were already sore, but he forced them to move with the same steady rhythm he had used before. He dug quickly, carving out a pit identical in shape to the first one. Each movement sent ripples of discomfort through his shoulders, yet he embraced the strain. The desert demanded effort, but effort spent with purpose always returned something in the end. When the pit reached the correct depth, he smoothed the walls with his bare hands and inspected the symmetry. It would trap heat efficiently if the angles remained consistent. He grabbed the reflective fabric from his pack and stretched it across the interior base. The fabric clung to the sand once he pressed stones along the edges. He arranged more plant roots into the center of the pit, breaking some of the thicker fragments to expose additional moisture. The roots gave off a faint earthy scent that vanished almost instantly in the heat. He placed a second container in the very center, adjusting its position until it remained perfectly level. He then reached for a transparent scrap of plastic he had spotted earlier, part of a discarded equipment panel. It was dirtier and more scratched than the visor, but it was clear enough to seal the pit. He laid it across the top and secured it with metal anchors, pushing them deep into the sand. The plastic sheet sagged slightly under its own weight, so he positioned a small stone at the center to form the same downward slope he had engineered in the first still. He stepped back and examined the structure carefully. It lacked the elegance of the original dome, but function mattered more than beauty. As long as the plastic heated evenly and allowed vapor to condense and run downward, the device would succeed. The sun's reflection shimmered across the surface of the sheet, and within minutes it warmed visibly, tightening the air beneath it. A faint haze rose from the soil as moisture began separating from the root fibers. He watched long enough to confirm that droplets were forming, then turned away to begin work on a third pit. Time pressed against him, pushing him forward with increasing urgency. He needed 3 stills operating at full efficiency to generate enough water before sunset. He refused to rely on a single device when he had the opportunity to multiply his results. He walked toward the collapsed tent frame he had noticed earlier and searched for more usable components. The frame's joints cracked as he bent them, but he managed to salvage several metal rods and a flexible panel that once formed part of the tent's roof. He shook off the sand and inspected its surface. It was cloudy and slightly opaque, but the material was thin enough to trap heat. He carried it back to the chosen spot for the third still, planting his boots firmly with each step. The wind picked up in small gusts, stirring the sand and brushing against the edges of the 2 functioning pits. He checked them quickly, ensuring the seals held. He then began digging again, this time with faster and more aggressive movements. His breathing grew heavier, and sweat dripped from his jawline onto the sand below. He did not slow down. His body protested, but his mind continued driving him forward. He shaped the pit with methodical precision, ignoring the burning sensation creeping across his palms. When he finished smoothing the interior, he lined it with more fabric, weighed it down with stones, and set the third container in place. He arranged another set of roots, crushing them slightly to release trapped moisture. Then he stretched the flexible tent panel across the opening and secured it with rods and anchors. The panel sagged unevenly, so he adjusted its corners until the slope formed a clean line toward the center. He placed a single heavy stone at the lowest point of the sag. The panel dipped perfectly. He crouched and watched as the sun heated the material, causing the interior to glow faintly. The condensation process began sooner than he expected. The third still responded to the heat even faster than the second one, likely due to the panel's thinner material. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction as he observed the droplets forming. He now had 3 functioning stills working under the harsh desert sun, each one drawing moisture from the environment and channeling it into containers that would sustain him through the test. He stood and wiped the sand from his knees. His throat tightened with thirst, but he ignored it. He would drink when the first container held enough liquid to justify consumption. For now, he had to ensure the stills operated at full efficiency. He checked the seals on all 3 structures again, pressing the edges deeper into the sand. The wind gusted softly, but none of the coverings lifted. Good. The operation held steady. He stepped back and surveyed his handiwork. The 3 stills rose like small domes scattered across the sand, shimmering under the relentless light. Their shapes distorted slightly in the heat, but each one remained intact. He could almost feel the moisture inside them gathering slowly into droplets, then sliding downward into the containers. The process fascinated him. It was not brute strength or advanced technology that would save him. It was thought. It was understanding. The desert had not changed. His approach had. He sank into a crouch, resting his elbows on his knees as he watched the stills. The cadets in the distance looked more desperate than before, some sitting with slumped shoulders, others pacing without purpose. None approached him. Perhaps they believed he was wasting his time. Perhaps they did not understand what he had built. He did not care. The desert did not reward pride. It rewarded those who used their minds, those who saw possibilities where others saw death. Liam ran a hand across his chin and looked toward the sun's position. He estimated several hours before the horizon dipped into evening, which meant he had time. As long as he kept the structures stable and allowed the heat to work uninterrupted, the stills would produce steadily increasing amounts of water. He needed patience and vigilance. The desert would not break him. It would bend to him because he understood how to speak its language. As he settled into the sand beside the outcrop, he felt the first flicker of confidence ignite within him, the confidence of someone who knew he had transformed a problem into a solution before anyone else had even recognized the opportunity. The sun drifted lower in the sky, shifting from a burning white glare to a deeper, more golden radiance that washed across the dunes in long, wavering strokes. The desert no longer screamed with heat, but it still pulsed with a slow, simmering intensity that clung to the air. Liam rose from his crouched resting position and stretched the stiffness from his back, then turned toward the first solar still. He approached it with quiet anticipation, sensing that the hours of consistent heat must have produced something substantial. The visor's underside no longer held only small beads of moisture. Instead, generous droplets clustered into heavy rivulets that slid toward the central slope, dripping steadily into the container below. A faint sound reached his ears, the soft, rhythmic tapping of water falling. It was delicate, but unmistakable. He knelt beside the pit, lifting the visor slightly to inspect the container. Clear liquid shimmered inside, reflecting the fading sunlight like molten crystal. His chest tightened with relief, not from desperation, but from the satisfaction of seeing method turn into result. He reached inside, careful not to spill a drop, and lifted the container to observe its weight. It was not full, but it held enough water to justify every hour he had spent working. He poured the liquid into one of the empty bottles hanging from his belt. The water flowed smoothly, pure and without sediment. He closed the lid tightly and set the bottle aside in the shade of the rock formation. He moved to the second still. The plastic sheet covering the pit sagged noticeably from the weight of condensed vapor. He lifted one edge and felt warm steam brush against his face. The container beneath it glistened with a respectable pool of water. He poured it carefully into the second bottle, watching the level rise until it reached the halfway point. He tightened the cap, then returned the container to the pit so it could continue gathering moisture until the sun finally surrendered to the horizon. He approached the third still with even greater interest. The thin tent panel had heated much faster than the other coverings, and he suspected it had accumulated more water. When he lifted the panel, he felt an immediate rush of warm, damp air. The container below was nearly brimming. He allowed himself a small nod of approval and poured the liquid into the third bottle. This one filled past the halfway mark, nearly reaching the top. The combined amount collected from all three pits was enough to sustain him for far longer than the exam demanded. It was more water than the instructors likely believed possible under these conditions. He placed the three bottles beside each other in the sand, turning them slightly so the dying sunlight illuminated their contents. The pale golden beams traveled through the clear liquid, making the bottles glow as if lit from within. Liam studied them with calm appreciation. Nothing about the desert had changed, only his response to it. His knowledge, patience, and precision had shaped the land's hidden moisture into something tangible, something undeniable. He rose and secured the bottles at his side, then took a long drink from the first one. The cool liquid rushed through his body with startling clarity, waking every sense, sharpening his thoughts, and steadying his pulse. He drank only a small amount, saving the rest for later, then stood facing the dunes just as shadows began stretching across the sand. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness. Several cadets moved toward him with unsteady gaits, their faces marked with exhaustion and disbelief. Some stared at the pits with wide-eyed confusion, unsure how Liam had coaxed water from a landscape that mocked them with relentless dryness. A few whispered among themselves, guessing at the purpose of the strange domes and the glistening droplets visible beneath their surfaces. None dared to speak to him directly. Perhaps they feared distracting him. Perhaps they resented him. Or perhaps the quiet confidence with which he worked unsettled them more than the sun ever could. Liam did not seek their attention. He checked his structures one last time, securing loose edges, adjusting the slope of one panel, and steadying an anchor that had loosened in the shifting sand. Everything remained stable. The stills would continue functioning until the sun dipped fully behind the dunes, gathering a final amount of moisture before the night cooled the air and slowed the process. He stood quietly beside them, waiting for the instructor's arrival. As the sun finally touched the horizon, the sound of engines rolled across the desert. A transport shuttle descended in a controlled arc, stirring the sand into swirling spirals as it landed near the cadets. The instructors stepped out in their immaculate desert uniforms, their expressions stern and unreadable. One of them, a tall man known for his rigid discipline, surveyed the test zone with a practiced eye. Several cadets approached him, eager to explain their struggles, but he dismissed their interruptions with a single gesture. His gaze shifted to the outcrop, where Liam stood beside the three stills. The instructor approached with heavy, deliberate steps. His boots sank into the sand with each motion. He stopped a few feet away and rested his hands on his hips. His eyes scanned the pits, lingering on the transparent coverings, the containers beneath, and finally the three bottles clipped to Liam's belt. His expression hardened, though not with anger, rather with something sharper, something bordering on disbelief. Liam met his gaze calmly, saying nothing. The instructor lowered himself to inspect the first pit. He lifted the visor, examined the moisture still clinging beneath it, then looked at the nearly dry container. He did the same with the second pit, then the third. His movements grew slower each time, more deliberate, as if he could not fully accept what he was witnessing. When he finally stood again, he stared directly at Liam. "How many bottles?" the instructor asked. "3," Liam answered simply. The instructor's jaw tightened. He glanced back at the other cadets, some of whom had collapsed from dehydration, others who had gathered only a handful of damp sand in desperation. He returned his gaze to Liam, and a faint shift appeared in his eyes. Respect, though restrained behind a professional facade. He extended his hand toward the bottles. "May I?" Liam unhooked one and passed it to him. The instructor lifted it, studying the clarity of the liquid. He uncapped it and smelled it cautiously. Then he tipped the bottle, allowing a small stream to run across his fingers. The water was clean, free of impurities, and undeniably real. He capped the bottle again and handed it back. He exhaled slowly, not with relief, but with the weight of realization settling over him. "You extracted water in a zone we designated as dry." Liam nodded once. "Moisture exists everywhere. The desert only hides it." The instructor's stern expression cracked, not into a smile, not into approval, but into something far more meaningful, a recognition of ingenuity, discipline, and mastery. He stepped aside, allowing the other instructors to examine the stills. Each one reacted with the same mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. The cadets watched in silence as the Academy's most seasoned survival experts studied the work of a single human who had ignored panic, embraced logic, and reshaped the exam with nothing but knowledge. When the instructors finally gathered the cadets for departure, the lead instructor addressed the group. His voice carried across the dunes with commanding clarity. "One of you proved today that survival is not a matter of waiting for resources. It is a matter of creating them. Remember that lesson." His gaze flicked briefly toward Liam before he turned away. Inside the shuttle, as the engines prepared for liftoff, Liam allowed himself a final glance at the desert below. The stills remained in the sand, like silent monuments to the day's work, simple structures built with scrap and patience, yet capable of overturning the instructor's expectations. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, he felt the full weight of what he had accomplished. He had not conquered the desert. He had understood it, and through that understanding, he had proven that the harshest environments held answers for those who refused to let fear dictate their decisions. As the shuttle rose into the deepening twilight, Liam sat quietly in his seat, the 3 bottles secured beside him. The raw heat of the day no longer pressed against him. Instead, a steady calm settled in his chest. A calm that came not from victory, but from the certainty that obstacles lost their power the moment he chose to examine them rather than fear them. The desert had tested him. He had answered.